Okay, so it's telling me now that this Hangout on Air is live. So wherever you are, whether you've just logged in, look at that, Alan, on the right on the nose there. Whether you've just logged in, whether you've been hanging around for a few moments, whether you're watching this live on YouTube or you're watching the recording of this on YouTube, hours, days, weeks, months, years later, welcome and thank you for watching this Hangout. Let me give you a little bit of context. For the past 48 hours, almost to the hour, here at HT2, we've been running something of an experiment. We've been running a massive open online course, or MOOC, on the subject of sales training. We've used it as a vehicle to really discuss some instructional design concepts, some ideas, some techniques, some ideas around touching and erring towards neuroscience, but not really going too far down that road. Yesterday, we kind of looked at the concept of information overload. We looked at memory. We looked at forgetting. And throughout the day, we had several conversations in Curator about that. And then this time yesterday evening, to the hour, we had a conversation in a Google Hangout with Dr. Will Talheimer about cognitive load, cognitive overload, cognitive dissonance, forgetting, memory, and all the challenges that go with that. And we went in all sorts of areas talking about it, largely due to the fact that Alan kept saying, tell us a bit more, Will, tell us a bit more, Will, and Will did. So we went all over the place. This evening and today, we've kind of flipped the coin a little bit. So Will set up the problems yesterday. He said the fact that the brain's a wonderful machine, but it's not infallible, and it has some downsides, and as instructional designers and people development people, we need to be aware of them. Today we flipped that coin and we've asked Julie Dirksen to come along and tell us how we might be able to design activities, people development activities, training, whatever you want to call it. How can we design things that help people do their jobs better, bearing in mind what we know about the way that the brain works and the way that people learn. So that's enough prattling on from me. Julie, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background about who you are.
Hi, my name is Julie Dirksen, and I tweet under the name Usable Learning, which is a reflection of the fact that I think my interests, well, I primarily identify as a big learning geek and being very nerdy about all things learning. I also have a sort of 1 foot over in the user experience camp, so thinking about kind of how do we leverage both instructional design and also things from user experience. I'm really interested in the brain learning side of things. What can we learn from the neuroscience base or from other kind of evidence and research that we bring back into our practice? So yeah, all of those different pieces. I try to sort of take some of these kind of complicated things and figure out how to explain them in ways that that are relatively easy to understand and to follow, and that's what I did in the book that I wrote called Design for How People Learn. So, so yeah, taking all of these different pieces and try to figure out how do we take some of this kind of complicated stuff and turn it into something that we can then actually take action on as designers of learning environments.
And that's pretty much what I said about when, after Will had finished introducing himself, was the fact that I let Will go and do all the hard work in terms of finding the research and analysing it and putting it into layperson's terms. And Julie, I look to people like you to be able to then take all of that and to be able to translate it in, so what can I do with it from layman's terms? So I'm sure on behalf of many people in the LD community, thank you for doing that, Julie. Really appreciate it. There's a few new faces in fact, no, there's just David. Hi, David. Thanks for joining us. You went in yesterday evening's Hangout, but you may have watched the recording since, but just a little bit of an orientation as to where everything is on the screen. There is a chat panel that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not, if you go to the left-hand side of your screen and move your mouse over there, you should get a menu bar appear, and one of the options is to have a chat bar, and it should then appear on the right-hand side. I tell you this for two reasons. One, I'll be dropping some links into there as we're going through today's session. And if you want to drop any links into there, or you want to ask any questions and you don't feel comfortable opening your microphone up because it's not working, or because dogs are on full tilt in the background, no names, no pack drill, then you can feel free to drop any questions or queries or anything into the chat panel there. And I hope I'll be able to pick them up on your behalf. If I do drop any links in, a big tip is try opening them up during this session. Don't look at them, please, keep them away in the browser. But once this session is over, the recording doesn't show the chat pod, and it's not like Adobe Connect where the chat links are still live. You won't get that chat panel in the recording. So if you want to follow those links, please open them up in session and then bookmark them later. A little tip from the top there, because I haven't in the past and I've really missed out. So Julie, if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump in feet first and ask a question. And I hope, as we did yesterday evening, that will then lead to other people asking questions, and I'm sure we'll go off in all sorts of directions, in all sorts of tangents, and have a really great remainder of the hour. So this MOOC has been ostensibly about sales training. Yes, as many people have spotted, the principles and theories can and should be applied to all sorts of training, but we've focused purely on sales for the time being. So I've got a question. The question is born really out of some comments and interactions that have been taking place over the past 2 days in the MOOC. So here's my question. In this day and age, listen to me, I sound like some old spins. In this day and age, is there any need to deliver training on features and functionality around our products? Is there any need to do that in 2016? Should we be spending more time developing the tacit knowledge that salespeople need, such as handling objections or such as reading buying signals? Is there any place for focusing on features and functionality and trying to get that into people's heads, or have we moved beyond that, and can we rely on things like phones and wearables and Post-its tacked onto people's months? Can we solely rely on the performance support and the job aids, or is there still a place for focusing on product features and functionality? Over to you, Julie.
Yep. Well, there's usually a couple of criteria that I think about when I'm kind of dealing with that question. Do we give people resources and expect them to access the resources, or do we need to sort of get it into their heads in some way so that they have that kind of immediate access? And so speed of access is actually one of those questions that sort of determines what approach that you need to have. So for example, I was working with a fast food company, and they were talking about what do you do when the store is being robbed. So if somebody's working behind the counter and somebody comes in to rob the store, that's a case where possibly you don't want the answers to be buried in a job aid, of what do you do when the store's being robbed. So that's the kind of thing where people need to have immediate access to the material, and so it actually does need to kind of be in their heads. It needs to be the kind of thing that they carry around. On the other hand, after the store has been robbed, after the person's already gone, the procedure for what do you do after the store has been robbed? Okay, you notify the authorities, you secure the premises, you do this and this and this. That procedure is a complete natural for a job aid, because it may not happen very often or ever to some people, or it may not happen for years. So you don't really want people to have to carry that information around in their head. It's unnecessary. But you want them to be able to do it right when the time comes. But pulling a checklist out of a drawer and going, okay, the store's been robbed, I need to do these 9 things, works really well. But you have plenty of time in that situation to pull the checklist out of the drawer and to access it. So I think that little litmus test kind of applies as well to sales training. Are there things that people need immediate access to? So if it would be awkward in the middle of the conversation for them to stop and go, wait, let me see if the widget has blah, blah, blah on it, then, that's a case where then maybe they do need to have that information and carry it around in their heads. Versus as long as they've got a general sense of the products and then they can pull up the details sort of as needed, being a case where maybe just knowing where to find it or knowing how to access the information would be fine. It's an interesting issue, because obviously salespeople need to be able to have at least sort of an initial conversation without stopping every 2 minutes to look something up. And so there's definitely a layer of knowledge that needs to exist. But it's also not realistic to think that they're going to carry around every single piece of information in their heads. And one of the big problems that I've seen traditionally in a lot of sales training is if we talk about cognitive load as an issue, like you get these features and benefits courses that are like nothing but massive lists of features and benefits and all of those kinds of things. And so that's next to useless because nobody's going to remember it all. And it doesn't really get into any of the application or how do you apply it. So learning features and benefits. So like, for example, I know my mother's phone number, but I never sat down to memorize it. You know, I didn't have to have an e-learning course, but because I use it, you know, reasonably often, although less often in the age of cell phones, you know, you're going to learn that stuff anyway. And so largely that's a case where really what we're probably looking at wanting to do is application practice rather than learning about the features of a product, learn about, you know, customers who have needs and which products will then, you know, meet those needs and that point. So then you would probably construct something that was entirely about, it was pretty much entirely about applying features and benefits rather than learning the features and benefits. And then you'll either learn them as part of application or you'll learn how to find them really quickly as part of application.
So I guess from somebody who's responsible for, it sounds like it's a balancing act between just enough but not too much, almost a perfect Goldilocks type of
Right.
too much, too little, just right, not enough.
Yeah.
I guess an analysis and looking at the data, and I'm sure Janet's grinning away to herself here, but looking at the data, looking at the analysis of what are customers asking for, what are the first half a dozen questions that customers will normally ask about this product or our product range, having access to that information and that data, and then being able to make sure that that is kind of stowed away in people's memory would be a starting point for making sure that you're not committing everything to some form of job aid, but similarly you're not trying to force that one in every 1,000 customer question into people's heads as well. So I guess getting access to the data about what customers are looking for and asking for would be a starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, most of the really good training applications around things that are information heavy or dense that really require that support is training that allows people to practice using the job aids, and that's built into the training course. Because a lot of times you see courses where it's like, well, here's all the information that's in the job aids, and then here's the job aid as a takeaway, as opposed to really looking more at application practice. So we're going to give you the job aids up front, and then we're going to give you situations or scenarios, and you're going to use the job aids to answer those questions. Those are two really different things. One is really, you know, a cognitive load, like heavy information dense delivery module, and the other one's more of how do I take this and apply it? And do I need to know it? Maybe. Or do I need to just be able to find it quickly? Maybe. Yeah. Which ones are which, you know, that's something where situations and scenarios are probably actually really important for helping figure out what do I need to carry around in my head versus what can I just access as needed.
The example you just gave there has prompted me and reminded me. I used to work for a private healthcare insurance provider, a global one, but primarily known here in the UK as Bupa. They were launching a new product. The product was similar in lots of respects to everything that they'd done before, but there were one or two, well, there were 5 or 6 areas where it was significantly different, dangerously different. They wanted originally me to create, funny old thing, some e-learning around that. That wasn't what they got in the end. What they got was a social experience in their Jive platform. And what we did was we created and recorded some spoof voicemails that sounded like they were coming from real leads and real potential customers. These customers were asking questions that suggested this new product was what they wanted, but it wasn't obvious, and they threw a few things into this voicemail around these 5 or 6 dangerously different areas. And that's all we kind of did. And then at the bottom of the exercise, there was a link to the very performance support tool that contained all of the answers that they needed. This tool had been around inside the business for many, many years, and whilst it was used, it wasn't used as regularly and it wasn't relied upon as regularly as the business really wanted it to be. So all we were doing was we were creating a catalyst, we were creating a burning bridge type of situation, and then we were giving them the very simple way of getting off that burning platform by following the link. So we created
Mm-hmm.
a social experience that mirrored as closely as it possibly could exactly what we wanted people to do in the real world, which was not try to remember it, but it was to go to the online performance support job aid to get the answers to their questions. And that went down really well. And funny old thing, it took a few hours to create. It took probably longer to get signed off. And it was significantly cheaper than creating hours worth of e-learning. So just what you said then about creating an experience that tries to mirror how we want them to use the job aid, it just caused that to come flooding back. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Any questions whilst I'm furiously looking at my list of things I've got to ask Julie? Is there anything that what I've said there or what Julie has said there that's prompted any questions or queries or any responses from anybody that's joined us this evening? Alan, David, Janet, Elena? No? Okay. Remember, if anything comes to mind, drop it into that chat panel or feel free to open your mic up or wave furiously and we'll stop talking. Julie, yesterday Will introduced us to introduced us to the concept of spacing and spaced repetition. He spoke about what, from a cognitive perspective, the value of doing that is, but we kind of stopped short about practically how do I do this in the real world. So I was wondering if you've got any examples that you could share with us whereby you've designed this in or you've seen people design this in. How have they done it? What tools have they used? Has it just been email? Has it been text message? Has it been physical desktop activities on their desk? What ways have you seen or have you used to bring this concept and this theory of spaced repetition into the real world?
Yeah, so there's a number of different kind of ways we've looked at using this or have used it in the past. Sometimes it's making sure that the learning experiences themselves are spaced out over time. So, for example, a weekly scenario or something like that, as opposed to trying to do everything all at once, because that's, you've been kind of alluding to cognitive load. That's an issue from a cognitive load point of view. And so if you have 30 new products that you need to learn as a salesperson, you can sit through all 30 of those, but you're not going to, what you're probably going to remember is a few at the beginning and a few at the end, and then the middle is going to kind of drop out. So at that point, what we might want to do is for example, and I've done this in different formats, have like sort of the weekly little piece on here's 3 products and we'll just focus on that and then kind of spread that information out and then tie back in kind of previous pieces of it. If you've ever done any language learning, things like the Pimsleur series with the CDs that you can listen to for a language, lesson 1 might be chatting about the weather and lesson 2 might be shopping and lesson 3 might be booking a hotel or whatever it is. But what they'll do really nicely is that in lesson 3, you're chatting about the hotel, and you can, then there's a little conversation about asking about the weather or, making a reference to the weather or, something like that, so that whatever it is you learned in lesson 1 starts to show up in kind of piecemeal fashion throughout the rest of it. Because if you only learn it once and then you never refer back to it, what probably happens is, you start kind of forgetting as soon as you learned it, and it doesn't get reinforced at any point. I've seen a couple of different nice versions of that. Art Cohn has a method that he calls 2+2+2, which is 2 days after a training, he'll ask a couple of factual questions about it. 2 weeks after the training, he'll ask some more kind of comprehension-based questions about it. And then 2 months after the training, they'll ask some application-based questions around it. And so, it's sort of a gradually increasing interval, but yet it still kind of causes you to pull the information back out of long-term memory, re-engage with it, and re-encode the information. And so even little touches of just having kind of gone, oh, right, that's what that was about, and then re-encoding it, and again, doing that over time can be a really nice sort of effective method for doing that. The other part of spacing, or kind of looking at things over time, is we look at sort of skill development, then that becomes a big issue because I was working with a group that it was a cable provider, so cable TV, internet, cell phones. They had all these things, and they had an enormous amount of product knowledge about each of the areas. This was for the customer service people, but it was customer service people who were also doing sales. So the way that the current training was structured is you'd get a whole day on internet, like all the features, benefits, everything you need to know about internet as a product. Then you get a whole day on cell phones, about cell phones as a product. Then you get a whole day about cable TV as a product or whatever it is. And then you might have a couple of days on sales training, and then you might have a couple of days on customer service and a few days on systems training. Well, that's that very sort of horizontal slicing that we see in curriculum development. So I'm going to do everything about internet as a product from start to finish, and everything about cell phones as a product from start to finish. Well, by the time you've gotten into the fourth or fifth or sixth day of this, you're just sort of floating in a sea of information at that point and completely overwhelmed. And whatever you learned on the first day is kind of faded into the background, and you're just trying to keep up with the new information that you're getting. And so one of the things we looked at was structuring much more of a kind of a level 1, 2, 3 product knowledge. So level 1 product knowledge was kind of the basics of stuff, and you learned all of that, and it got tied in with some sales, and it got tied in with some customer service. Once you sort of got certified at level 1, then the next week you might come back and go through and do level 2 product knowledge, where you're getting into the deeper dive for each of these and more of the kind of tricky, functional things, and then come back once you've done that and kind of come back and do level 3 product knowledge. So each time, so you get exposed to the details of internet or cell phone service as a service, and the features and benefits, and how do you deal with customers, and how do you handle problems or requests or any of those kinds of things. But you kind of get this sort of gradual ramping up of complexity about it and things like that. And then also it does get spaced out. So you're going to get at least 3 touches with, if not more, you're going to get at least 3 touches with a cell phone service as a product. In addition, they would do the class, the way that we structured it, they would do the classes in the morning, and then they would sit with somebody and listen to them take calls in the afternoon. And so then they were also hearing how an experienced person interacted with people around any of these different products, and they would get the opportunity to ask questions between calls, or those kinds of things. And so that meant by the time they were actually ready to go out on the floor, they had probably 6 to 12 different sort of interactions with say cell phone service as a product, the way that they handled it, as opposed to just a single day where you just do the whole thing start to finish. So there's a lot of different ways to think about structuring, kind of spacing things, just so that people get more than one exposure.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Julie. Thanks for giving us that sort of the wealth of your experience and what you've seen with people doing around spacing. Are there any questions that anybody in the audience has got about that? Because I know that this was we spent quite a lot of time on this yesterday evening, from a why should we be doing it, and what does it help to overcome. And there were quite a lot of questions banding around about spacing. And that's been replicated in the MOOC itself. So I'm just wondering if there's anybody that's on the panel this evening wants to look at this in a bit more detail, or take a slightly different perspective to the question that I asked. Alan.
Julie, no, I think it was fascinating, and I liked the 2x2x2 element. I guess from a sort of a scientific point of view, any clues as to what works best? Oh, we've got Nick arriving just in time. Hi, Nick. Any insights in terms of either other approaches or nice sort of formulas that you think actually work really well?
I know that ART has done some research on the 2+2+2, and they found that's kind of a nice optimized sort of general model for their purposes, because you get an almost immediate 2 days later you get a pretty quick touch point with it, but then it gradually spaces it out over time. A lot of there's some research, it's called, I think, the corrective feedback paradigm or whatever, that looks at reinforcing things. So they did their research with flashcards. So when you're learning something using flashcards, which is kind of a pretty context-free environment, but nonetheless, if you're learning something with flashcards, the tendency is, okay, I got that one wrong, but I'm going to put it on the bottom of the pile. So let's say you've got a pile of 50 cards and you're going through the pile of 50 cards. So the problem with that is if you put it on the bottom of the pile, you don't see it again for 50 cards. And so by then you may or may not remember that you got that one wrong and what the right answer is and things like that. And so when they did their research, they found it was much more effective that if I get this one wrong and I check the right answer, if I put it back 2 cards or 3 cards in the pile so that I see it again fairly quickly, and then I can reinforce the right answer at that point. And then once I've gotten that one right, assuming I do, if you keep getting it wrong, you keep putting it back like 2 cards in the pile until you get correct practice. Then what I can do is instead of putting it back 2 cards in the pile, I might put it back 4 or 5 cards in the pile. And then when it comes back over, if I get it right again, I can put it back 7 or 8 cards in the pile. And so gradually increasing intervals of time, but still verifying that I get it right. If I get it wrong at any of those stages, then I should go back to putting it just 2 cards back in the pile. So if you get something right straight out of the gate, it's okay to push it back a little bit further or to even put it on the bottom of the pile. But if you're getting something wrong, you want reinforcement of the right answer more quickly. And so that probably has an impact on kind of how you think about spacing, depending on whether or not, if it's something that somebody knew pretty well right out of the gate or recognized pretty well, then it's probably not as important to reinforce right away. But if it's something that people get wrong, then bringing it back up sooner rather than later can be a really useful way of correcting the wrong error and reinforcing the right answer.
Fantastic, thanks, Julie. In terms of, so that's good as far as kind of knowledgey stuff is concerned. Yeah. What about the sort of the other skills, perhaps the softer skills, the interpersonal skills? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, that's a really interesting problem. One of the things I've started doing with clients when I'm working with them is have them estimate. And of course, there's no right answer to this question, so it's a good way to get them thinking about it. Having them estimate how much of what they're teaching somebody is tacit versus explicit. So certain things like these are the features of this particular product are clearly an explicit skill, but something that is a tacit skill you learn through basically pattern recognition. So years and years ago, one of my early jobs out of college was teaching GMAT classes. So this is for people who are going to business school. They're going to take the GMAT test to go get an MBA. And it was a really horrible job, actually. But what it was is they would come in for a whole weekend the week before they were going to take the test. And we would start on Friday night with a test, and we'd end on Sunday afternoon with a test. And usually, and then we'd study for the weekend, and there were a lot of study strategies and little tricks and all of these kinds of things. And so usually what would happen is we could typically bump up, there were sort of math and logic sections in the GMAT, and we could typically bump people's scores up about 100 points out of, I don't know, possible 800 points or something on the math sections and on the logic sections. But then there was a reading comprehension section. So reading, vocabulary, things like that, sort of a verbal reasoning section. And that score was much harder to budge. And so typically that one didn't change very much. Well, if you think about the way that you acquire these two skills, so with math, a lot of these people hadn't had geometry since high school, so they just needed to learn the formula for a circumference of a circle. Or there were some tricky formats in the math section, so if you just learned how to do the problems or what the format was, that would usually help your score. So those are very explicit skills. We can explain them, without, we can say, here's the rules for doing it, here's the steps of the procedure. Reading comprehension, on the other hand, is very much a tacit skill. And the way that you get better at reading comprehension is you read a lot, right? And maybe test your comprehension of things. So probably recall practice or retrieval practice or application are good practice methods for that. But there's no trick for being good at reading comprehension, or at least not many. There are a couple of little things. But so we're not going to budge that skill over the course of a weekend, because that's a skill that it took people years and years of basically kind of tacit pattern recognition to acquire the ability to read a complicated passage and glean meaning from it and things like that. Well, that has really interesting implications if we start to think about how do we design for both of those things. So if we're designing for explicit skills, that I can explain to you pretty easily, and then you can practice it, and great, you can get pretty good at it. If we're talking about tacit skills, and sales certainly is loaded with tacit skills, what are the signs that a customer might be ready to buy, or how do you respond to customer objections, or how do you build rapport? Well, those are all things we can give you some general guidelines about how to do that, but really getting good at that is the kind of thing that, again, it's like reading comprehension. You've learned it over years and years and years. And so that's a place where you have to start. There's two kind of big things. One is whenever the reason I get customers to kind of, clients to kind of think through what's tacit, what's explicit, is if we put it into the tacit bucket of this is the kind of thing we learn through experience and pattern recognition, then it's really nice, easy segue to talk about the fact that we might have to be doing some kind of experiential learning where they get to practice or they get to role play or they get to do some of those kinds of things. And I can start to have a conversation of, well, how many role plays or how many cases is it going to be before people start to really get the idea around this? And the other part of that is you also can start to set some expectations about how quickly somebody's going to learn to do that. Now, a really experienced salesperson can bring their prior knowledge to bear and maybe pick something up pretty quickly, but maybe a less experienced salesperson is really going to need, a pretty intense amount of practice in order to start to get good at some of those things, and they need to be in scenarios that are, sort of realistic enough that you can do things like really look and see what a customer is doing. Are they fidgeting while you're telling them about the product, or are they paying attention, or are they humoring you, or is it a real, is it real interest, or any of those kinds of things that are, again, that sort of very tacit knowledge kind of stuff that takes a long time to get good at.
Julie, it's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
And thank you for asking it as well, Alan. Much appreciated. While Julie's been talking, just at the beginning of a response, she mentioned about flashcards. So I've just dropped in a couple of links into the chat around a tool called Anki, A-N-K-I. It's a web-based flashcard type of system, but underneath it is quite a smart algorithm bordering on sort of AI, and it will understand what you've got wrong, and as Julie said, it will present those back to you sooner rather than later. It takes into account the spacing effect. And one of the really cool things it does is it can be used as a collaborative tool. So if a group of people are studying a subject, they can each write their own flashcards, but then those flashcards will actually be shared amongst the group. So whilst you might all be focusing on a specific question, the way that somebody has written that question, the nuances of the language that they've used may be subtly different from person to person. So in terms of from a synthesizing perspective, I guess it's really good for being able to respond to the same question, but that's being asked in different ways, which I guess from a sales perspective, customers will all probably ask very similar questions to each other, but may phrase them slightly differently. So that I've just dropped the links into there. If anyone wants to go down that rabbit hole once the session's finished, please do. So, Julie, we chatted and we joked a little bit at the beginning about I'm going to be a little bit selfish now. I'm going to ask you a question that I think will still be of value to everybody that's here and everybody that's watching this afterwards. But Janet and I came along to your session at LSCon last month in Florida around creating and promoting digital habits. Mm-hmm. It really struck with me because I follow a guy here in the UK called Nick Shackleton-Jones, and he's talking about this spectrum, if you like, moving from courses to resources to apps, and he sees apps as being at the moment the optimal thing because they're incredibly good, and I guess we're incredibly conditioned. I'm grinning because lots of us here at HT2 are taking part in a fitness challenge. They're really good at conditioning us to subtly over time change our behaviours and practices, our habits. So I'm really keen to find out more about this question that you've got relating to habits. So could you tell us a little bit more about this about the design of habits and being able to tap into people's habits, because I guess in the past we've spent a lot of time creating the training, providing the resources. People have, dare I say it, they've passed a test or they've said that it was great, and so everything's rosy in the garden and off they go. But of course, if they don't apply it, and if they don't apply it regularly, and if they don't apply it without sometimes even thinking about it, has everything that's gone before been a bit of a waste of time? So talk to us about habits, if you would, please, Julie.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm kind of really interested in right now is just this sort of question of what are the sort of core elements of any kind of learning system. And I think one of our challenges as a field has been that our core elements, or our kind of the core DNA of most of our learning systems has been information delivery, and that's a very limited view of kind of what learning is. And so we've kind of got some strategies around information delivery, and we've got flashcard apps and things like that. But then like skill development becomes a big question. That's been one of the reasons I'm interested in game design, is because game designers are really good at skill development. But then there's times where there's something else that's sort of missing from the equation. So for example, let's say I want to get, I want to take, oh gosh, I live in Minnesota where we don't get a lot of, it's cold and you hide inside most of the winter. And so I want to get into the habit of taking vitamin D over the winter so that I don't get, vitamin D deficient or whatever. Well, I can know that vitamin D is a good idea to do it. I have the ability to do that. Like, that's not a particularly difficult skill, is to take a vitamin. I can be motivated to do it, and yet there's still something that's not happening, right? There's still something that's missing from, and it can still not happen. You can have good intentions, you can have the knowledge, you can have the ability, you can even have the motivation, and yet you still can't quite make it happen. And it really kind of comes down to, we're sort of left with habit at that point. That's the sort of missing piece of things. Now, granted, there are some habits we would like people to have that maybe they also need some help with the motivation, or they also need some help with the skill. But you can have all of those things and you can still not have a habit around something. So then you start looking at the problem of, well, what can we actually do to inculcate the habit with people? So as you do social learning stuff, obviously habits are a big piece of that. So if people have a question, you want them to have the habit of going into the system and asking the question. Or if people have an interesting resource, you want them to have the habit of going, hey, that's an interesting resource. I won't just send it in an email to my colleague. Instead, I'm going to go post it over here in the discussion area so that other people can have access to that as well. And so the difference between those things, it's not knowledge, it's not skill, frequently it's not even motivation. People want to do that stuff, but they don't remember to, or they don't have the habit for doing it. And so in any of those cases where it seems like the thing that's really missing, or part of what's really missing, is the habit of it, then a lot of our sort of traditional strategies of telling people about it, or trying to sell them on it, or any of those, trying to teach them how to do it, those things only go so far, because we don't have a knowledge problem, we don't even have a skill problem, we don't even have a motivation problem, we have a habit problem. So how can we encourage people to make something like that more of a habit? And typically there's a bunch of different definitions that does nothing but look at different definitions of habit and argue about them. So if anybody wants the source on that, let me know. But there's about 8 or 9 that are floating around in the academic world. But largely what we're talking about is an almost automatic behavior in response to a particular trigger. Something that you do, automatically or almost automatically. So there's a couple things in that. One is the fact that there's probably a trigger that causes you to respond. So let's say I want a manager to have the habit of giving feedback to their employees. Somebody's trying to really work on being good about doing that on a more regular basis. So you'd want to look for some triggers that say, these would be good times for me to give feedback to employees. So maybe as soon as an employee sends me a status update email, that's a good time for me to give them feedback. Or as soon as after we have a project meeting, that's a good time for me to give somebody feedback, or things like that. So I'm going to look for triggers in my environment that tell me, hey, that's an opportunity, potentially an opportunity for me to give feedback. And within that, I need to decide then what's my response when I see that trigger. So if I see this trigger, I'm going to have this response. So if somebody sends me a product update email, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hit respond right away. That's going to be my response. And I'm going to at least, I'm either going to give them feedback on the thing they said, or if I don't have any particular feedback to give them, I'm just going to say thank you. That's my little script for how I'm going to develop that habit. So when I see this trigger, I'm going to do this behavior. And that's, the term for that is called an implementation intention. And Peter Gollwitzer is the researcher who's done a lot of work on that. And so what you can do is you can sort of set these little scripts up for yourself ahead of time. When this happens, I'm going to do this. And then try to kind of work your way into it. There needs to be some kind of usually reinforcement. So, you know, if your team appreciates the feedback, or if it does seem like the feedback's working, that's going to help you keep doing it. Or if you get some other kind of response, or you get some other kind of reinforcer. In Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, one of my favorite examples from that book, I think he's a little looser with his definition of habit than what I've seen elsewhere, but one of my favorite examples in the book is he was talking about getting people into the habit of brushing their teeth with toothpaste. So the toothpaste marketing people wanted, obviously, people to buy toothpaste. This is in the 20s or the 30s or something like that. So one of the things that they did is they added in that sort of minty, tingly taste to the toothpaste. It actually doesn't have anything to do with the cleaning properties of the toothpaste. So that kind of minty, tingly taste is actually a slightly acidic thing that sort of actually irritates your gums slightly. It doesn't have any functional purpose, but it gives you that sort of slightly satisfying feeling after you've brushed your teeth that you're like, oh, my mouth's all kind of tingly and clean now. And so that acts as a reinforcement for the behavior, and it, you know, I think the belief is that somehow your mouth is cleaner because it has that tingly feeling, but in actuality it has nothing to do with the cleanliness of the toothpaste, but it does kind of tell you, hey, I did this and it feels sort of satisfying, and so therefore acts as reinforcement for the habit that I've done. So looking at how do you help people identify the triggers, how do you have them identify the behaviors up front that they're going to do in response to the triggers, and then how do you give them some kind of feedback so that when they do the behavior they get some kind of reinforcement around it.
Thank you, Julie. From a sales perspective, can you think of any examples of the way that we can integrate triggers, these habits, these triggers, the behaviors around the design of sales training?
Yeah, we do this somewhat already. I mean, some of this is already built pretty heavily into sales training. So dealing with customer objections, for example, is a case where there's kind of a habit nature to that. So if you look for this trigger, the customer says this thing, here's the response that I'm going to predetermine, and hopefully the reinforcer is, you know, either successfully dealing with a customer objection or, you know, things like that. But I find that salespeople actually are very have very strong habits, and the challenge with that is when you're trying to change their habits. So you were sort of asking about kind of the feature and benefit training and product training up front and things like that. Well, one of the challenges that definitely crops up is the salespeople selling products that they're comfortable with, and that they're comfortable with the method that they use to sell those. So, for example, I've talked to a number of different organizations over the last few years, and one of the big buzzwords in sales training is moving from product-based selling to consultative selling. So instead of you going in and saying, here's my product and here's why it's fabulous, you go in instead, you say, tell me about your problems. What are your challenges? You know, are there things we can help you with? You know, that kind of thing. So that shift has a number of issues, because if people are really in a very much a product-based selling mode, then they have a lot of habits around doing that. So if they hear, you know, if they hear a buying signal, they're going to jump right in there and go for it. Or if their habit is to sorry, I was getting a prompt note about the hangout for something, so throw me out for a minute. But there are a bunch of habits, and I find that salespeople, when I've worked with them in the past, you know, they have their sort of pattern, they have their way of explaining certain things, and it's very automated for them. They could do it in their sleep. And so the issue is how do you sort of insert new habits into that, and also how do you undo old habits? So if they have a really strong set of habits around product selling and you want them to switch to consultative, then you have to plan for that to be a slow process of developing new habits. Habits are typically automated, and automated things are typically cognitively easier. If it's automatic and I know it really well and it's built in, it's cognitively the equivalent of biking downhill, and trying to add in a new habit is going back uphill and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Again, anybody got any questions? I'll come back on that. And anybody that's watching live as well, I know we've had some, not questions as such, but we've had some observations from Dan Roddy. Thanks for tuning in via YouTube. Dan, how weird am I sort of waving, saying thanks for tuning in on YouTube. But Dan, if you've got any questions or any observations or anything that's been said, feel free to take the same process that you've followed for those observations about Anki. Anybody on the panel that's in the room got any questions? I'll come back with Julie. Okay, so I think I have a final question. I might be cheeky and ask two, but I've got a final question, Julie. The name of this level in the MOOC is called Less is More. The name of the Hangout is called Less is More. One of the approaches that we've looked at during this second day has been Kathy Moore's action mapping process to help try and filter out some of the more and focus a little bit on some of the less. Are there any other techniques that you're aware of that can help, particularly probably in consultation with the subject matter expert, that I imagine want all of their wealth of experience pouring into the activity? Because why wouldn't everybody want to share their 22 years of experience in this subject? Why would anybody not be interested? Have you got any techniques or any strategies or any other tools or techniques that you're aware of beyond action mapping that you might be able to advise people on to try and filter out a lot of stuff and focus on the really important stuff?
Yeah, so one of the things that I do with clients is when they're doing their learning objectives, I make sure that it's something that could happen in the real world and something where you can tell, and that really focuses it on applied, which is similar to kind of what Kathy's doing in terms of really focusing on the application and then just having kind of that informational piece be the support piece for it. I think that her action mapping gets you to that pretty well. So instead of I'm going to tell you every single thing about this particular product, instead I'm going to give you scenarios where you have to choose a product for a customer, and then you can go looking for the application materials. There's a term called decision fatigue, and that happens really quickly when you're presented with 6 million options for things and so forth. I'm currently trying to buy a car, and I get decision fatigue almost immediately as soon as I open up car websites, because there's so many pieces of information, there's so many kinds of things. And so one of the things I sort of kind of talked about a little bit before, which is this idea of leveling up, can be really nice, because one of the things that really governs cognitive load is not just how dense the subject matter is, but how much context the learner already has for something. So for example, I was teaching, an example might be, we were creating a curriculum for project managers for electrical installations. So these are the people who go in and do the electrical wiring in a new building or something like that. And if I try to tell them everything about how to create a budget for one of these projects, that's an enormous amount of information. And some of it is explicit information, like literally how do you enter it into the system, how do you make sure that the budget's complete. But then there's all this other stuff around how do you make sure that it's a good budget, and how do you kind of monitor the budget to make sure that you're staying in budget, and how do you identify problem areas. Well, if I try to do that all at once, that's an enormous cognitive load. And so what I'm going to do in that instance is we broke it into, we had an e-learning on how to enter it into the computer system so that we could just kind of get that out of the way. But then we would work through increasingly complex budgets. So I might start with a small budget on a small project, and then once you do a good job with that, I'm going to work into I might start with a $10,000 budget, and then I might go to a $30,000 budget. And each level, I'm going to make sure that you've kind of got your complete knowledge. And then by the time I get into a $50,000 budget or a $200,000 budget, which is much more complicated, much more much more dense in terms of the information, the learner, because they started with this $5,000 for $10,000 budget, has a framework for what the pieces are of a budget. And so they're not trying to learn that at the same time that they're trying to learn kind of all these complicated, subtle things. And so really that's sort of like continually going from sort of simple to more complex situations. And the same thing with the product knowledge for the customer service reps, or we've done this for, oh gosh, what are some other ones? I was doing this one for a health NGO that was teaching people how to do health improvement studies. And so we do a really simple study that's more of just a case study, and then we have them practice, then we have them apply it to their own problem. So by the time they're doing complicated things with it, they're at the 4th or 5th exposure to one of these projects from start to finish. So they already have the basics in their head, and so then I'm not expecting them to have to understand it all over again when I get into a more complicated example. So anything that's really dense, having that sort of layering of kind of like a simple example that gets increasingly complex, and then increasingly complex examples, means that then the framework becomes very familiar and very automatic, and then it's the only complexity you're having to deal with is what's different about this new example.
Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate you going into the detail that you did with that particular response. Elaine has asked a question in the chat panel, but I think the second question I was going to ask, which is a very similar question to the final question I asked Will yesterday evening, and he laughed at me and ridiculed me and pointed his finger at me. So I'm going to ask the same question again, just for some sake of synchronicity between the two. But before I ask this final question, because I'm conscious that we're approaching the top of the hour, are there any questions again from the panel? Anything that Julie's mentioned that you want her to expand upon or go off in a slightly different direction, or indeed anything that we've not gone into that you kind of like to go into in these last few minutes? Over to you guys. None of those mute buttons are looking at being unclear. Okay, so I'll weigh in with my final question, and of course I'm open to ridicule on it. It might also answer Elena's question, so I'll take the flak for it if it does. I asked Will the question last night that he covered a lot of detail and a lot of different areas, as you have done, thankfully, Julie. If I were to say to you, you've seen a lot of different L&D activities taking place in lots of different areas, in different sectors, using different approaches. Is there one thing that, as an industry, as practitioners, we're getting wrong repeatedly, that if we could get our heads wrapped around it, would significantly raise the bar as to what we do as an industry? What's the common pitfall that you see us falling into time and time and time again?
Oh yeah. I have an answer for this one. I think our biggest issue. I'm getting the echo. Is that yours? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it was. I think the single biggest issue we have in the industry is we're not getting enough feedback on our own work. And I can pretty regularly ask a whole group of people at a conference how many people have ever watched anybody use their e-learning, and I don't think I've ever gotten above half in terms of the people responding to it. So even something like user testing, using a webinar to watch somebody go through your e-learning course, and we don't have enough data about the efficacy of it. Janet and I have had this conversation any number of times, but one of the big issues that I'm looking at, she's trying to figure out the data problem, which God bless. But I actually, one of my sort of soapbox topics lately has been at least doing qualitative evaluation. So I'm a big fan of like the Brinkerhoff success case model, or something like calling people up 4 or 6 weeks after they take your course, and just having a conversation with them about what worked, what didn't work, what do they remember, what are they, excuse me, what are they using, that kind of thing. We typically, especially in e-learning, have this tendency to sort of throw it over the fence and then never kind of go back to it. I think it happens a little less in some of the social platforms that you're using, but basically, what's anything, if at all possible, that I can do to see how can I get some feedback coming back into to me as a designer about what's working and what's not working. It could be watching somebody use it. It could be talking to them afterwards. It could be, some of our traditional learning, evaluation measures. Although I think if we've been talking about Kirkpatrick's levels for 40 plus years or whatever it is, and we're still not really doing level 3 evaluation for behavior change at a useful rate, then maybe we need to look for some other solutions. And like I said, like smaller scale qualitative is I think a good way into that if you lacking access to significant amounts of data or an infrastructure, because a lot of organizations don't collect any kind of metrics about performance, and so that makes it really difficult for us in learning and development to make that happen.
So I guess feedback then, talking to people, looking at people, reviewing people, being a fly on the wall when people are interacting with our products. That's the pitfall that's what we're not doing enough of.
Yes. That's my feeling on it.
I'm so pleased that you mentioned Brinkerhoff there, because we've recently used it at HT2 for some of the people that went through a MOOC towards the end of last year. Almost did a carbon copy approach of what Robert Brinkerhoff suggests, and we got some fantastic positive feedback in terms of the way that people have used it, the impact that it's had, the monetary impact that it's had, as well as the efficacy impact. And I also noticed, and plug it again, just to the design for our as well. You mentioned give a good, simple overview as to what Brinkerhoff's success case methodology is in here. So I'm pleased to. I don't hear people mentioning it often enough. So I'm pleased I'm in the same camp as you. That's a little kudos. Thank you. So it's just gone the top of the hour. I'm not going to keep anybody holding on any longer, because obviously we committed to this being an hour, and it's been that give or take a few minutes. Could I ask you all, as you did yesterday evening, if you'd give Julie a wonderful rapturous round of applause, a thumbs up, an emoticon, open up your mic and cheer at her, not jeer, cheer at her. And yeah, there we go. We've got some feedback coming in. So, Julie, on behalf, fantastic. Thank you, Alan. On behalf of everyone that's in the panel now, on behalf of everyone that I know, there's several people watching this on YouTube Live as well, and I'm sure on behalf of the people that are going to watch this when the recording is wrapped up and placed onto YouTube, a huge thanks, Julie, for you carving out this time for us, for sharing the benefit of your expertise, pointing many of us, me included, in a slightly better direction than what we've been facing before. Julie, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been fun.
Thanks.